Your soulmate needs to talk to you immediately. Something big just happened. My beloved child. Your soulmate needs to talk to you immediately, because something happened that they never expected, and ever since it happened, they haven't been able to think about anything else. A moment came when something connected to you suddenly surfaced in their life. It may have been a message, a conversation, a memory, or even a truth they had been avoiding for a long time. Whatever it was, it hit them differently this time. They froze. They went quiet. And for the first time, they realized that staying silent might cost them something they can't replace. There's a reason this message is reaching you now. Something shifted behind the scenes, and your soulmate is carrying an emotion they can no longer keep buried. They may have tried to distract themselves, convince themselves they were fine, or tell themselves that enough time had passed. But something big just happened, and it forced them to look directly at what they still feel for you. Don't skip, because the next clue explains why they suddenly feel such an urgent need to speak. What happened next was even more unexpected. Your soulmate came across something that reminded them of a moment between you, something small that you probably thought they had forgotten. Maybe it was a place, a photograph, a familiar phrase, or something connected to a conversation you once had. But instead of simply remembering you, they suddenly understood something they had completely misunderstood before. They realized that your silence wasn't necessarily rejection. Your distance wasn't necessarily indifference. And the things they once interpreted as signs that you had moved on may have actually been signs that you were protecting your heart. That realization created a wave of emotion they weren't prepared for. They started asking themselves questions they had avoided for months. What if I had spoken sooner? What if I'm running out of time? What if they're waiting for me, but they're too afraid to say it? Stay till the end, because there is one detail about this situation that changes the entire meaning of what happened, and your soulmate has already made a decision because of it. Right now, they may be closer to reaching out than you realize. But this isn't just about sending a casual message or saying hello after a long silence. Their urgency comes from something deeper. They want to explain what happened. They want you to understand why they pulled away, why they hesitated, and why they couldn't stop thinking about you even when they tried. Something inside them finally broke through the fear that had been keeping them quiet. And there's one particular truth they're struggling to put into words: they don't want to lose the possibility of you because they waited too long to be honest. That's why their energy feels different now. They're not simply remembering the past, they're looking at the future and realizing that you might not be waiting forever. Something huge is waiting for you, but before they say what's really on their heart, there's one final thing that happened tonight that may explain why they suddenly feel they have to talk to you immediately. Something changed the moment your soulmate realized that you might actually be moving forward without them. Until now, they could tell themselves there was still time. They could delay the conversation, postpone the decision, and pretend their feelings would eventually disappear. But then something happened that made the possibility of losing you feel real. Maybe they heard something about your life, noticed a change they weren't expecting, or suddenly saw you differently from a distance. Whatever triggered it, their heart reacted before their mind could explain it. They realized they don't just miss you, they miss the version of themselves that existed when you were close. And that realization brought back every unfinished conversation, every unsent message, every moment when they almost told you the truth but stopped themselves. Now they're replaying those moments differently. They're wondering whether you still feel anything at all. And that's where their urgency begins. But there's another layer they haven't told you yet. Your soulmate has been carrying a particular regret, and something that happened recently brought it straight to the surface. They remember a moment when you needed reassurance, honesty, or simply a sign that they cared, and instead of giving you what you needed, they stayed quiet. At the time, they may have believed silence would protect them from getting hurt. Now they understand that silence created distance. They know you couldn't read what was happening inside them, because they never gave you the chance. And the hardest part is that they now realize you may have walked away believing you weren't important enough. That thought is hurting them more than they expected. They're beginning to understand that love isn't always lost because feelings disappear. Sometimes it's almost lost because two people are too afraid to say what they really mean. And tonight, they're facing the consequences of that silence. There's something else, though, and this is the clue you shouldn't ignore. Your soulmate isn't only thinking about what happened between you in the past. They're thinking about what they're going to do next. A decision is forming in their mind, and it involves finally breaking the pattern that kept both of you stuck in uncertainty. They may still be nervous. They may still wonder how you'll respond. But the fear of never knowing has started becoming stronger than the fear of being rejected. That's why this feels urgent. They don't want another week, another month, or another missed opportunity to pass without saying what has been sitting inside their heart. And just when they were preparing themselves to reach out, something unexpected happened. Something they saw or discovered that gave them one final reason to believe they couldn't stay silent anymore. The unexpected thing happened when your soulmate received a piece of information they weren't prepared for. It wasn't necessarily dramatic on the outside, but emotionally, it hit like a shockwave. Someone mentioned your name. They saw something connected to you. Or they suddenly learned something about your life that made them realize how much they had missed while standing at a distance. For a moment, they didn't know how to react. They simply stared at the situation, trying to process what it meant. Because the truth they had been avoiding became impossible to ignore, life was continuing, with or without them. And the thought of you creating new memories, meeting new people, or simply becoming happier without their presence awakened a fear they had been hiding. Not jealousy. Not control. Something more vulnerable, a fear that they had waited so long to speak that you might no longer have room for them in your heart. That realization changed the way they were looking at everything. Then came the memory they couldn't escape. Your soulmate remembered one specific moment when the two of you were together, and suddenly they understood why it had stayed with them for so long. They remembered your expression, your voice, the way you looked at them when you thought they weren't paying attention. Back then, they may have dismissed it as an ordinary moment. Now it feels like evidence of something they were too emotionally overwhelmed to recognize. They started wondering whether you had been trying to tell them something without actually saying it. And the more they thought about it, the more another question appeared: what if the connection between you was never really finished? That question has been following them everywhere. It has affected their sleep, their focus, and even the decisions they're making right now. Don't skip, because the next realization is where this becomes much more serious. Your soulmate has finally reached a point where pretending doesn't work anymore. They can stay busy, surround themselves with people, act completely normal, and tell themselves they've moved on, but the moment everything becomes quiet, their thoughts return to you. And now they aren't only remembering what they lost. They're imagining what could still be possible if they were brave enough to tell you the truth. That's why they need to talk to you immediately. There is something they want you to know before another misunderstanding gets in the way. They want to explain a decision they made, a choice that affected the distance between you, and the reason they kept it hidden. But here's the part they haven't figured out yet. They don't know whether you're going to welcome their honesty or finally close the door they left open for so long. And that uncertainty is exactly what is pushing them toward the conversation they've been afraid to have. The decision your soulmate made wasn't impulsive. It came after a long internal battle, and something that happened recently finally pushed them past the point of hesitation. They realized they could keep protecting themselves from an uncomfortable conversation, or they could risk being honest and finally find out where they truly stand with you. For the first time, they chose honesty. They began thinking about exactly what they would say if you were standing in front of them. They rehearsed the opening sentence in their head, changed it, erased it, and started again. Because how do you explain months of silence when your heart never actually became silent? How do you tell someone you cared when your actions made it look like you didn't? That's the problem they're facing now. They know an apology alone won't explain everything. They need you to understand what was happening behind their silence, and why they suddenly can't keep pretending anymore. Then they discovered something that made the situation even more emotional. They realized you may have been protecting yourself in exactly the same way they were. While they were waiting for a sign from you, you may have been waiting for a sign from them. Two people, both afraid of rejection, both interpreting silence as an answer, both secretly wondering whether the other person had stopped caring. That realization shook them. They started seeing the past through completely different eyes. The moments they thought were endings may have actually been pauses. The distance they thought was permanent may have been created by fear rather than a lack of feeling. And now they're wondering how much could have changed if just one of you had spoken honestly sooner. Stay till the end, because there's a reason this realization happened now instead of months ago, and it connects directly to what they're preparing to do next. Your soulmate is now standing at an emotional crossroads. One direction leads back into silence, where everything remains safe but unfinished. The other requires courage. The kind that makes your heart race because you have no control over the answer. And despite all their fear, they're leaning toward the second choice. They want to reach out. They want to hear your voice. They want to know whether there is still a place for them in your world. But before they make that move, they have one confession they need to get past their own fear of saying. It involves the real reason they pulled away in the first place, and it isn't the reason you were given. Or the reason you may have believed. They've kept this hidden because admitting it would mean exposing the most vulnerable part of themselves. And now that truth is finally ready to come out. The truth your soulmate has been hiding is more emotional than you realize. They didn't pull away because they stopped caring. They pulled away because caring started to feel too real. Somewhere along the way, they realized this connection could actually change their life, and that frightened them. They knew that if they allowed themselves to fully open their heart, they wouldn't be able to control what happened next. So instead of moving closer, they created distance. They convinced themselves that silence was easier than vulnerability. But something big happened recently that destroyed that excuse. They were confronted with the possibility that you might finally stop waiting for them, and suddenly all the defenses they had built began falling apart. They realized that protecting themselves from emotional risk might have cost them the very person they were trying so hard not to lose. And now there's one sentence they keep forming in their mind, over and over: should have told you the truth sooner. What makes this moment different is that they're no longer blaming circumstances. They're looking at their own choices. They remember the times they could have reached out but didn't. The moments they could have explained themselves but chose silence. The opportunities they let pass because they were afraid of what your response might reveal. And now they understand something painful: you were never asking them to be perfect. You were asking them to be real. That realization has created a completely different kind of urgency. They don't just want to tell you that they miss you. They want to explain what was happening inside them when they seemed distant, cold, or uncertain. They want you to know that there were feelings behind those actions that you never got to see. Don't skip, because the next part of their confession reveals why they suddenly believe waiting any longer could change everything. And then came the moment that finally made them reach for their phone. They had been thinking about contacting you, but they kept stopping themselves. Then they saw something that reminded them of you at exactly the wrong, or perhaps the right, moment. It brought back the emotion they had been trying to bury, and this time they couldn't push it away. Their heart told them that another silent night would only create another regret. So they started writing. They stared at the message for a long time. They changed the words. Deleted them. Started again. Because they don't want to send something meaningless. They want you to understand that this message carries the weight of everything they never said. But there's one final sentence they're debating whether to include, and if they send it, the conversation between you may never be the same again. The sentence they've been afraid to send is simple, but it carries everything they've been unable to say: I need to tell you what really happened. Your soulmate knows that once those words are sent, there's no hiding behind silence anymore. They'll have to explain the choices they made, the distance they created, and the feelings they tried to bury. That's why they've been staring at the screen instead of pressing send. They're not wondering whether they care about you. They already know they do. They're wondering whether you still care enough to hear them. And that question is terrifying because your soulmate knows they may have used up the patience you once had for them. But then another thought hits them. If they stay silent because they're afraid, they'll spend even longer wondering what could have happened if they had simply been brave. So they take a breath, read the message one more time, and prepare themselves for the possibility that your response could change everything. Then something unexpected happens. Before sending the message, they notice one small detail that reminds them of why they fell for you in the first place. It could be something as ordinary as a phrase you used, a place you once mentioned, or a memory that suddenly feels incredibly vivid. But instead of making them nostalgic, it gives them clarity. They realize they aren't trying to recreate the past. They're trying to find out whether there is still a future worth fighting for. That distinction changes everything. Their message becomes more honest. Less guarded. They stop trying to sound strong and finally allow themselves to sound human. They want to admit that they were scared. They want to admit that they made mistakes. Most importantly, they want you to know that their silence never meant you were forgotten. Stay till the end, because what happens immediately after they finally decide to send that message reveals just how serious this moment has become. And then their finger finally moves toward the screen. For a few seconds, everything feels strangely still. They read your name. They hesitate. Then they press send. The message leaves their phone, and suddenly there's nothing left for them to control. No editing. No deleting the words. No hiding behind another excuse. They sit there wondering whether you'll read it, whether you'll understand it, and whether you'll respond. But the biggest surprise is what they included at the very end. They didn't simply ask to talk. They admitted that something changed inside them, and they can't go back to pretending they feel nothing. They told you that they've been carrying something they should have shared much earlier. And now, while they wait for your response, another truth is beginning to surface, one that may explain exactly what something big really was. The truth behind that message is finally coming into focus. Your soulmate wasn't simply reaching out because they missed you. Something happened that made them realize how quickly life can change, and it forced them to confront a possibility they had been avoiding. You may not always be available when they finally find the courage to return. That thought broke through every excuse they had been using. They realized that waiting for the perfect moment had already cost them too many moments. So when they sent that message, they weren't testing you. They weren't playing a game. They were finally choosing honesty over fear. And as they watched the screen, waiting for your response, they understood something that had taken them far too long to see. You were never asking them for a perfect story. You were asking for the truth. That realization changed the emotional weight of everything they wanted to say next. Then came the response they had been afraid to see. Your soulmate noticed something that made their heart stop for a moment, because it suggested that the door between you might not be completely closed. Maybe there was a small sign of openness. Maybe they saw that you had received the message. Maybe there was simply silence, but this time, they didn't interpret silence as rejection. They understood that you might need time to process everything. For once, they were willing to be patient. They didn't immediately retreat. They didn't delete the message or convince themselves they had made a mistake. Instead, they stayed with the discomfort and allowed themselves to feel everything they had been avoiding. And in that quiet moment, they made one more decision. If you give them the chance to speak, they will tell you everything. Not the edited version. Not the safe version. Everything. Because the biggest thing that happened wasn't outside of them, it happened inside them. They finally stopped running from what they feel for you. They finally accepted that some connections cannot simply be erased because they become inconvenient, complicated, or frightening. Your soulmate knows the next conversation may be emotional, uncomfortable, and completely unexpected. But they also know it could bring the clarity both of you have needed for a long time. So if that message comes, don't rush to judge the first sentence. Listen for what's underneath it. There may be an apology hidden behind the explanation, a confession hidden behind the hesitation, and a future hidden behind the fear. Something big already happened, they chose to stop hiding. And now the next move may be yours, because the conversation they've been afraid to have is finally ready to.